So I thought I would just start by explaining a bit about the inspiration for the panel today and what theoretically and practically we hope to cover. The panel title itself is, of course, rather general, creating leverage. Isn't that what every panel is about? Creating social movement leverage. Basically, the inspiration for the panel was that I was talking with Michael Schwartz here over the last couple of months, and at one point we were talking about how we don't feel like there is enough explicit strategy making that goes on in social movements. That basically many social movement organizations end up wasting a lot of energy. In that they don't take the time to develop a coherent strategy for how they want to achieve what they want to achieve. And we also feel like many times there's a lack of attention to the sources of power in society and how a social movement can exercise power. Many times when social movements do that, the strategy they devise is elect different candidates. Be they Democrats or third-party candidates. So our focus here is first of all on non-electoral means of exercising power as a social movement. The kind of theoretical concept that unites all of these 5 presentations that we're going to hear is that of structural and non-institutional power. Non-institutional in that it does not derive from the state itself. And structural in that it derives from the collective position that individuals play within a structure of exploitation. Such that by withdrawing their participation in collective fashion from that system, they can make it cease to function and thereby exercise power. So some of the classic examples would be labor strikes, consumer boycotts, GI resistance movement, all of which are kind of going to be touched upon a little bit here today. And there are other examples that we could think of. Now, incidentally, it was actually Michael Schwartz who sort of theorized this concept in the 70s. One of the deals for him being on the panel today was that I have to promote his work and talk about how iconic it is. So that's just a kind of prerequisite for him agreeing to be on the panel so that he can sell more books. But I think it is a very useful concept in thinking about how to build power as a social movement, this concept of structural, non-institutional power. I think that the reason it appeals to me personally is that over the last few years we've seen a lot of Democrats elected to office, many people hoping that their election would bring certain changes in policy. Even those of us who didn't expect much from people like Obama ended up being, I guess, surprised a little bit at the lack of at least some progressive policy change. So this concept of structural power is a way to, in effect, take the power out of the hands of politicians and CEOs and generals and the people who are traditionally thought of as holding power in society. So that's why I find it so appealing. And I also think the concept has important consequences and implications for our everyday work and social movements. Now, in some struggles and some issues, it's quite difficult to figure out exactly how this sort of structural power, this sort of structural leverage would be exercised. It's not always readily apparent. In certain other realms, like labor and anti-war activism, which are the 2 areas of focus here today, it's a little bit easier to kind of devise these sorts of tactics. So I think I will save the short introduction to each speaker for just before they speak. So first we have Michael Schwartz, who is professor of sociology at SUNY Stony Brook out on Long Island, author of a bunch of books, most recently War Without End, The Iraq War in Context, which came out in 2008 with Haymarket. I see someone clapping in the back there. Very good analysis of the geopolitical backgrounds to the Iraq War, as well as the course of the Iraq War. So he's going to be speaking about what he calls the Obama conundrum.
I'm meant to be preliminary to those who are actually going to talk about ways of generating leverage. I want to offer a kind of thumbnail sketch of what I think the Obama conundrum is, practically speaking, meaning that for a lot of people, the election of Obama and veto-proof majorities in both the House and the Senate was going to imply, at a minimum, the reversal of some of the more obnoxious Bush administration policies. And instead, what we've seen is a kind of continuation and even amplification of those policies with a few little hiccups in that pattern. And I think a lot of people are saying, well, what happened and why? And I want to just outline what I think the answers that people have come up with have been, and to try to codify them in a way that will allow us to get a look at what creates this kind of conservative, and we'll call it conservative momentum, that the Obama administration has not reversed. And I think the three modalities of explanation that have emerged, I call them the electoral modality, in which there's an electoral logic that defeats Obama or defeats the liberal policies that Obama might have enacted. The structural argument that says, well, it's simply impossible for the government to have accomplished this even with these veto-proof majorities in the presidency. And then the third being what I call the wand in the wind of class struggle argument, which is that the government is simply pushed around by larger forces, and you can't expect a government to behave in any way except simply expressive of which of these forces are victorious. Now, I want to focus today on the question of these electoral logics, partly because I think that's the one that everybody was invested in 2008 when Obama was elected, but also to try to extract from that a sense of what, let's say, progressive forces might want to do to offset the fact that the electoral logic seems not to have produced the kinds of results that so many people expected. Let me just give one example of this electoral logic that I think is expressive of a lot of the way people think about it, is to look at, let's say, the stimulus, the rescue from the financial crisis and a whole bunch of associated things. Let's take, for one thing, a meaningful jobs program that didn't emerge, that one would have expected. You've elected the Democrat on the basis of labor. He had advocated for a jobs program, and we really didn't get very much of a jobs program. And I think the electoral logic says, well, look at what look at what Obama and the Democrats faced in terms of getting this done, and at the bottom line, it would work out to be, if they pushed for this, it would be called socialism by the Republicans, they would be abandoned by certain Democrats, and ultimately in the 2010 election, pressing for this would have been an electoral kind of catastrophe, and it would have taken away from the ability of the Obama administration to perform in any case. Now, of course, we're now past 2010, and we know that pattern obtained even without the jobs program, and that he lost great ground in the election. But I want to call out one element in that I think is really important for us to focus on and think about, which is that logic, which I think applies in a lot of situations. I'm not calling it out as, oh, this is bullshit, right? But that logic has as its assumption, and I think it's an important assumption, is that there's a very large element of discretion here. That it assumes that, okay, the Democrats would have liked to have done this, or Obama himself could have done it. One of the possibilities was for Obama to do it ex cathedra out of the executive office, using the various rescue money that was being returned to the government. This has been proposed by a number of people, that he could have done it without any legislative authority at all and begun a really serious jobs program. So he wouldn't have even had to gather Congress together. So why wouldn't he do that, right? Okay, well, one argument is that it would have been stopped by the courts, or Congress would have found a way to stop him. And let's leave that aside for a second. I think that's very important. That's the structural barrier, right, to doing this. But the other more directly electoral logic was the idea that, well, in 2010 he would be crucified with it, right? And he would lose ground tremendously, so he sacrificed the policy in order to protect his electoral chances for himself and the Democrats, in order to, have a chance to have a kind of full-scale ruling, regime, let's call it. There's an element of discretion there that's very important, right? In that logic, and I think this is something that we really have to think about a lot, is that it suggests that Obama does have a lot of room to maneuver, or at least some room to maneuver. He could do things, and he doesn't do them because he would rather have a better chance at re-election, or would protect himself or other Democrats from diselection, than enact the policy. The policy is not more important to him than the re-election. So that there's always this, in the electoral calculus, there's always this element of that, right, in which a really committed ideologue like President Bush, right, is willing to risk diselection in order to get at least some policies through. Whereas what we observe here is the idea that, okay, yes, the Democrats or Obama had the real power to do this, but they decided not to do it because they thought re-election or the protection against diselection was more important. So it suggests that there really is within government the power to enact at least certain of these policies. It was within his grasp to do it, but there was something more important, which was re-election, right? And I want to just take that as a point, right, that we look at and say, you could, if you narrow the scope of looking at all of the policies in the Obama administration, and I mean empirically, I find this to be true when I talk to people about this, right, is you can take each of the things, the non-closure of Guantanamo, failing. There's so many of these instances in which people say, well, why didn't Obama do X? Climate change, various kinds of climate change, a mountaintop removal of, in coal mining, just one right after another. Why didn't he do it? And you can answer it every single time as this discretionary electoral argument. Yeah, he could have done it, but he didn't want to risk diselection. Right? He didn't want to risk the diselection of Rockefeller in West Virginia for mountaintop removal. He didn't want to risk his own diselection in 2010 because of climate change, and on down the road. And so what you see is that there's this kind of, the electoral argument contains within it the sense that the government really has a lot of power, that that Obama himself has a lot of power, and he's choosing not to exercise it in the interest of electoral logic. Now, the problem with this argument, and I think the way that we have to think about it really clearly is that, well, why isn't our threat greater than their threat? Our electoral threat greater than their electoral threat? Why would he think that following through on campaign promises would get him diselected? And under this logic, if you look at it closely, what you see is that there's two things going on. One of them is that that there is a real sense, I think a real logic that makes a lot of sense, that says, from an electoral point of view, the leverage, the ability of large, let's just call it corporate interests, but you could also easily put in a calculus of military interest that's not just industrial but also inside the government, the large electoral leverage that these interests have are more pervasive, more enduring, and more reliable than public opinion leverage in the election. So that if there's a division between public opinion and some major industrial interest, then what you do is you end up going with the major industrial, corporate, Wall Street interest. So that kind of argument suggests that there is a sort of blockage to the entire electoral strategy that suggests if you get somebody elected, here's what happens, right? They follow through, at least to some degree, in the areas where they really have the room to maneuver in order to promise their own reelection. But instead what it turns out is that this internal electoral logic suggests that, oh, even if he ran on an anti-war platform, if it came up to re-election and he had actually withdrawn from Afghanistan and there were all these problems in Afghanistan, the electoral logic would reverse itself. Now, I want to just, I want to sort of hone in on that one piece of this argument in order to get a sense of how it works, okay? And to do that, there's a wonderful article that was published in the New Yorker about climate change legislation. Now, this involves not only the Obama administration, but the Senate and the House of Representatives. If you remember this, the House of Representatives was ready and able to pass not the most wonderful climate change legislation in the world, but at least it was something, right? And the whole thing foundered in the Senate. And Ryan Lizzo, who wrote this New Yorker article, has some very interesting accounts of how this came to be that I think is very important. Okay, at the critical strategic moment in the ultimately unsuccessful effort, right, mounted by three senators. The three senators were John Kerry of Massachusetts, the Republican Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and the independent former Democrat Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut. These are the three, and Lisa refers to them as, how does he refer to them? As, by their initials, KGL. So when you hear that come up, you'll see. And here's what he says. He says if they had to win some Republican support because they had lost some Democratic support. And they needed 3 or 4 Republicans in order to pass this legislation. And they decided to win the Republican support by going straight to their backers, to the industry backers. If the oil companies and the nuclear industry and the utilities, those are the 3 big corporate interests, okay, who really had a stake in the climate change legislation, the greatest stake. Oil companies, nuclear industry, utilities, could be persuaded to support the legislation if these industries were persuaded to support the legislation. And by the industries, we mean, of course, the largest dominant corporations within the industries. Then they would lobby the Republicans to vote for the bill. Lieberman A. Danielle Rosengarten, called the strategy, quote, "If you build it, they will come." This is straight out of a Kevin Costner movie, Field of Dreams. This was the strategy Obama had used to pass health care. Listen carefully. He sent his toughest political operatives, like Rahm Emanuel and Jim Messina, to cut deals with the pharmaceutical industry and hospitals, which at key points refrained from attacking the bill, right? The pharmaceutical industry actually ultimately ran ads thanking Harry Reid for passing the bill. In 2010, KGL shifted its focus from the Senate to industry to use the same strategy, right? Now, the political operatives, Rahm Emanuel, now the mayor of Chicago, and Jim Messina, went to the various industries and they cut a deal, right? And the deal involved, among other things, taking out of course, single payer was off the table already at that point, but taking out even a national federal health insurance program, right? They cut a deal with the industry in which the industry got to say, look, this is unacceptable to us, but we'll accept that. There was pressure on both sides, and there were compromises made, and from the government point of view, the compromise that was made was eliminating the national health insurance policy and a large number of other things, right? And that the negotiation is now between the administration and the industry on an electoral logic, right? Because it's in order to get the support of senators, who these are their industrial backers, upon whom they rely for re-election. Later in the article, Lisa reviews the various factors that led to the demise of the KGL effort. It failed anyway. They went, they negotiated, they were unable to negotiate a deal. It all collapses. It's a very interesting article. It's well worth reading. And then he goes to Al Gore, Lisa, the author, and he's talking to him about this failure. And he says, I asked Al Gore why he thought climate legislation had failed. He cited several reasons, including Republican partisanship, which had prevented moderates from becoming part of the coalition in favor of the bill. The Great Recession made the effort even more difficult, he added. Quote, this is Gore speaking, the forces wedded to the old patterns still have enough influence that they were able to use the fear of economic turndown as a way of slowing the progress towards this big transition we have to make. The influence of special interests is now up to an extremely unhealthy level. What he's saying is very interesting, and it has to do with this structural logic, which says if you pass the climate change legislation the way you want to do it, it's going to affect these key industries, and then these key industries are going to produce another economic downturn, i.e. recession, maybe triggering that big depression that we just avoided. So we can't really go near that because of this, right? But then on the whole other side, Gore offers another logic. Well, maybe that was just a fear, it wasn't really real, right? And they could have gone ahead and done it. And he says this, he says, and it's to the point where it's virtually impossible for participants in the current political system to enact any significant change without first seeking and gaining permission from the largest commercial interests who are most affected by the proposed change. That's Gore speaking. Okay, yeah. I call that the Gorean proposition, right? What he's saying is that the decision-making process in American politics, and not just the decision-making process in which legislation takes place, but in enforcement takes place. It goes through a process of negotiating, I love this phrase, right, the largest commercial interests who are most affected by the proposed change, right, which suggests that instead of having a government which sits above these industries and makes decisions about regulating them, we now have a different model in which the government negotiates with them around a proposal that in which their fundamental interests are protected, right, and accepted, right? And of course, what this suggests is that you're never going to be able to enact a policy that actually interferes with their fundamental interest, infringes on their fundamental interest, unless they are willing to go along with it. And to me, that's really the critical point. Because even in places where you get through to the policy, we see this over and over again. Perhaps the best of this is that when they actually did pass that stimulus plan, right? It wasn't really that much of a jobs-oriented stimulus plan, but they did pass a stimulus plan, right? In Congress, House and Senate both voted that all stimulus projects had to adhere to strict EPA guidelines. That nothing should go through that was going to compromise environmental issues, right? And there was a struggle in Congress around that, and the good guys won, and that went in. And then when the Obama administration enacted this policy, they exempted 97% of all these proposals from environmental regulation. 97%. That's by dollars. Actually, the the proportion is only 85%, but by dollars, the larger ones are the ones that were exempted, right? Now, why did this happen? Well, when you read about how this happened, what you find out is that when they were doing the actual decision-making around what kind of stimulus programs they were actually going to enact and fund, right, what they did was they actually had the corporations, the industries involved, make the decision about whether the environmental regulation should be suspended in this case. And they were asked to make the decision on the basis of whether enforcing the environmental decisions would harm their economic interest of these highly important industries that were enacting, like the public utility industry is another actor in this, right? All over the place, the stimulus money went to public utility industries to modernize plant, to do this and the other. And if it was going to compromise their ability to become more economically efficient, to create jobs, to do this, then the environmental regulation should be suspended. And who was better able to judge whether that was the case but the contractors themselves? So the logic is perfectly clear that the Gorean proposition that they get a veto power, it was applied not just in the setting of making legislation, creating policy, but also in the setting of enforcing policy, right? And that's strictly within the administration, right? And what I would want to propose is that you have this very kind of situation extending through all of the policymaking process. I mean, even to the point when Obama is trying to figure out what he's going to do about the crisis in Egypt before Mubarak sets down, what he does is he creates a special envoy, Frank Wisner, who happens to represent the Egyptian government as a lobbyist, right, to go over there and find out what position the government ought to have. So even in that setting, you have the interest that has the most powerful and abiding interest with that, which is that the economic connections between American business and the Mubarak regime to decide what the Mubarak policy should be. Now, of course, Wisner completely goofed it up, right? And it became a kind of public humiliation for the regime, but nevertheless, the logic of it is the same as what we're talking about. Now, what I want to extract from this is one actual practical point about what progressive forces might do to get progressive policy. If we look back at the really great moments of progressive change, what we see is a very clear pattern. Let me just take two very easy to use examples. The creation of the welfare state in the 1930s, and in particular the legalization of unionization, the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Board, which is now practically defunct, but in those days it actually had some bite to it. And the other is all of the changes that the civil rights movement wrought. Now, in both of these situations, it's very easy for us looking at the panorama to say two very easy things about this. One of them is there's a big legislative piece to all that happened in both of those situations, taking the Wagner Act as one, which legalized unions, among other things. And in the civil rights movement, there were all those civil rights laws that were passed in 64, 65, right? But we also know, without even blinking, that the main thrust of the movements in those days was directly attacking the source of the problem, not calling for a government strategy to enact or carry out the work of the movement, but rather in the South in the 60s, huge disruptive social movements directly attacking the edifice of segregation. And in the 30s, you have this massive union movement attacking the companies themselves. And what I would say is that what's less visible to all of us, when you look at the legislative process, which was not inconsequential here, right? What you see is that as the labor movement in the 30s battered itself and battered the corporate structure, and as the civil rights movement battered the Southern segregation structure, the resistance of those structures in Washington was reduced. Over a period of time, they were willing to give in because they were being defeated out in the field, right? And I think even for small things like mountaintop removal, not big, huge policies like we're talking about there, right? But mountaintop removal, even this EPA regulation, right? This little EPA regulation that was attached to the stimulus bill, the reason why, if you have a system in which the government is going to go to the utility industry and say, okay, we're going to give you some stimulus money, should we suspend environmental regulations? If you're going to ask them, which is how it works, then what you need to do is apply the pressure to the utility industry so that they say, no, we'll honor it this time. The pressure has to be put directly on the target. We can't have a strategy that says we can go to the government using an electoral strategy, get the right people in office, and then expect them to go ahead and impose a policy. We may get some help from elected officials in terms of putting forward policies, but in the end, unless the object, the target of those policies, is itself under pressure, we're not going to see real change. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to go next because my presentation is also kind of a general big picture kind of perspective. And then we have 3 presentations after that that are more focused on the ground, based in experience, I'll say. So the starting point for my argument is the common assumption that I think is pretty pervasive on throughout the political spectrum in the United States, that the white working class in this country tends to be conservative or reactionary or co-opted. I've never really been wholly convinced of this argument. And the first reason why is because of my background growing up in rural Pennsylvania, in a predominantly working class town, 95% white. I guess the attitudes and the values that I saw reflected in what people would say and do never really meshed with this notion that the white working class was conservative. And the second reason, as I began to follow public opinion polls closely a few years ago, I started to really believe that rather than being conservative, the U.S. working class and even the white working class, people who are often targeted by right-wing forces like the Tea Party for recruitment, this segment of the population has a very solid core of what I think are very progressive values and instincts. And this is the argument that I want to make. So I want to provide a little bit of detail on what I think are the specific contours of public opinion, and specifically the opinions and values of the white working class in the United States. And then try to offer some proposals about how the left can proceed. I think far too often we neglect this entire segment of the population as not having the potential for participating in a left movement. Amen. Yeah. So the first area where I think the progressive values of the U.S. public are evident is in the realm of economics and class. If you look at public opinion polls from going decades back, people are profoundly distrustful of large corporations. That's maybe the clearest trend that I've seen. A collection of polls done by Gallup, Harris, and Pew in the last few years have shown that 84% of people think corporations should have less political power. Less than 15% deem the companies in most major industries to be, quote, generally honest and trustworthy. So these are pretty remarkable statistics. We hear about people's distrust of government, right? That's what we hear about most in the corporate press from politicians. But in fact, according to a poll done in August of 2010 by worldpublicopinion.org, the reason so many people sympathize with the Tea Party, over half the population say they feel sympathy for the Tea Party, is not because they dislike big government. It's that they feel the government doesn't work in their interests. They feel that it is essentially controlled by a few interests working on their own behalf. That's about 81% of the public feels that way about government, that it is profoundly broken, undemocratic, unrepresentative of the people's will. A couple years ago, when there was debate over raising the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, polls regularly showed that over 80% of the public favored an increase in the minimum wage. And that was incidentally common to both registered Republicans and Democrats. There was a virtual bipartisan consensus within the rank and file of these parties on the need to raise the minimum wage. So people in general think that workers should have more power and more income, and that corporations and the rich should have less. These are pretty clear trends in public opinion. Furthermore, people think that government should actively intervene on the behalf of the mass of the population. People have a fairly expansive notion of human rights. At least 3/4 of the population considers education and food to be basic human rights that the government has a duty to guarantee. More surprising, perhaps, is that a strong majority of the public favors single-payer health care. Not only are food and education human rights, but access to health care is as well. And this is, again, consistent over many decades, right up until the most recent polls. A very strong majority, sometimes as much as 77%, thinks that the government has a duty to guarantee everyone access to free health care. In an August 2008 poll, even 57% of those people who planned to vote for McCain in the election agreed with that notion. So we see this, a general bipartisan consensus around issues of economics, class, and political power. Just to run through a couple of very recent polls from the last couple of months, as this, the controversy over union rights and, these evil teachers and so forth has flared up. What are the public's budgetary priorities? How do members of the public, particularly the working class, prefer to spend the budget? Well, there was a poll that was released, I think, in early January by 60 Minutes and Vanity Fair. Polls sometimes do this, the more detailed ones. They give respondents a list of options for how they want to spend the national budget. If you could allocate money as you wanted, how would you do it? Well, this particular one was asking, how would you reduce the deficit? The overwhelming majority said that they would first increase taxes on the wealthy, that was 61%, or cut military spending, another 21%. So 81% of the population saying that in order to cut the deficit, we should tax the rich, cut the Pentagon. 4% of people would cut Medicare, 3% would cut Social Security. A more detailed poll released last month by the Program for Public Consultation and Knowledge Networks at the University of Maryland found that, and this is consistent with prior polls, that respondents would cut annual spending on wars and the military by an average of $122 billion. By contrast, the top programs for which respondents would increase spending were job training, higher education, conservation and renewable energy, and primary and secondary school funding. The issue of conservation and renewable energy is interesting in that the public generally has only a very vague idea of the sources of global warming. Thanks to the enormous disinformation campaigns, very well funded by big industry, to convince people that the science on global warming is false, basically. That global warming is this natural process. and they've convinced a majority of the public. 42% of the public, only 42% of the public believes that global warming is the result of human activity. So despite that disinformation, people still favor things like the Kyoto Protocol. About 2/3 of the public favors the government requiring utilities to spend more money on renewable energy resources, even if that would mean an increase in taxes. With regard to the U.S. role in the world, the public favors diplomacy, international law, and the use of international institutions instead of a unilateral, militaristic, aggressive foreign policy. So what all this says, in my view, is that as progressive movements, we have enormous opportunities for organizing the public. Even this segment, the white working class, which is often neglected or dismissed. In particular, polls show that people have a particularly hard aversion to this sort of arbitrary, concentrated power and wealth that is characteristic of a corporate-dominated society. And it's this sort of libertarian political culture in the white United States that I think we need to look at a bit more closely. And that it's not, I think that it doesn't consign people to being reactionaries. I think there's enormous opportunity for working and expanding upon that sort of political culture, because many of its instincts are, I think, fundamentally healthy. So one question is, why do over half of the population feel sympathy with the Tea Party? Now, I agree with the caveat of some writers like Paul Street and Anthony DiMaggio, who have pointed out that the Tea Party really isn't, it's not a working class run movement. I think that the working class nature of the movement has been wildly exaggerated, right? It's a corporate funded movement dominated by the rich and powerful. But nonetheless, the fact remains that 52%, according to World Public Opinion last year, feel sympathy, in quote, with the Tea Party. So how and why have the forces of right-wing populism been able to appeal to so many people? The first explanation I would offer is that we need to make a distinction between people's normative values and their opinions being more dependent on the information to which they have access. And this example of climate change is instructive in this regard. People believe that the government should regulate industry in order to protect the environment and people's health. But they don't have a clear sense of the basic science. 42% think that global warming is the result of human activity. Again, that's a pretty startling statistic, given the scientific consensus out there. Another example of the lack of information, a strong majority of people who voted for Bush in 2004 favored the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol to limit global carbon emissions. But a majority also thought that Bush himself favored the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, which of course he didn't. So these are some examples of, this is one example of how the disjunction between people's values and knowledge is very important. Other examples are pretty numerous. Polls have shown that people dramatically underestimate both the level of military spending in the country and the level of socioeconomic inequality. And there are other examples, especially with regard to Iraq. A poll done, for example, in 2007, respondents thought, on average, they were asked to estimate how many civilian casualties there were in Iraq. The average response was between 9,000 and 10,000 people. So this was months after that famous Lancet study that had estimated about 655,000 civilian casualties, or Iraqi casualties in general. So even more conservative estimates than that were ranging in the 100 to 200,000 range. So this is one factor, this disjunction between normative values and people's knowledge. Another factor, obviously, is the enormous economic deprivation that has only increased over the last 30 years as real wages have stagnated, companies have moved overseas, living standards have fallen. And the right has been able to appeal to what I think is largely very legitimate anger and progressive instincts on in people's minds. There's a very useful quote from a recent documentary that was done by Big Noise Films called White Power USA. There is a prominent white supremacist interviewed in this film saying, quote, "I'm petrified whether I'm working the next day or not. And this is all we got. This is the last thing we got to stand on, man." So it's this economic deprivation that the right seizes upon and of course seeks to blame on scapegoats, immigrants, Muslims, women, blacks, gays, everybody else. But the core point that I want to emphasize is here that the right needs to appeal to what are usually understandable instincts and values, in understandable grievances that people have. Now, it's in a very demagogic way that they do so, but they need to work from people's everyday lived experiences. So at the same time, of course, the right appeals to instincts and values that are not healthy. Things like racism, sexism, sort of nationalistic chauvinism. So these instincts coexist with the more progressive instincts within the working class, the white working class as a whole. So we as the left, I think, need to, at the same time that we seek to expand upon these more healthy instincts, work to combat the more negative ones. But I think that by using the sorts of economic and political grievances that people have as a kind of starting point for discussion, it's a useful way to open up a dialogue and encourage more thoughtful, in-depth reflection on the causes and the culprits of their grievances. I think that despite the enormous racism and other exclusionary tendencies within the white working class, we have seen evidence of enormous potential for attitudinal changes. And this leads me to be somewhat optimistic. One of the most famous books on U.S. public opinion in the 20th century, called The Rational Public, the authors note that the most dramatic example of attitudinal change over the course of the 20th century was on the question of civil rights. In the 40s, the white U.S. public almost universally opposed desegregation. 50 years later, that had dramatically reversed. There was almost unanimous support for the principle of desegregation. Likewise, in the past 10 years, we've seen a very significant rise in the percentage of people who deem homosexuality, quote, morally acceptable. It's gone from about 40 to over a majority in the most recent polls. So that's a substantial improvement. And I think even, apart from the generational shifts, I think even within the individual white worker, there's enormous potential for this kind of transformation. And I'll just close with two quick anecdotes. I was in Boston a couple weeks ago for a union training, and listening to this white unionist speak from South Boston, thick Boston accent, and talking about how he was raised, the climate in which he was raised sort of inclined him to look upon black workers with a lot of suspicion, resentment. But through the process of organizing, first organizing a union for restaurant workers and caterers, and subsequently struggling side by side with people of other races, he very quickly learned to overcome these negative instincts. He said it was almost a necessity that we were struggling side by side. We recognized each other's humanity. And it was really inspiring to hear him speak about his own personal transformation. Likewise, we see this in many of the reports of veterans who are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. They describe having very racist assumptions going into the wars. But one veteran that I interviewed recently described his process of transformation as, quote, an evolution of empathy. This evolution of empathy. Being in Iraq, he was in Iraq in, I think, 2004. And this sense of being on the ground and sort of, in a way, being in the same sort of misery and the same struggle as Iraqi civilians. So it had this very profound effect on him. So I think in closing, I would just say that there are plenty of obstacles, as we all know and don't need to hear again, to organizing the U.S. working class. But I think what some of these results show, some of these public opinion polls, is that there's an enormous, very solid, healthy base upon which to build as we go forward. Thanks. Michael Zweig is a professor of economics at Stony Brook University. Author of a number of books, most recently The Working Class Majority, America's Best Kept Secret in 2001, and in 2004, What's Class Got to Do with It? American Society in the 21st Century, which he edited. He's also the director of the Center for the Study of Working Class Life at Stony Brook, and a leading organizer in U.S. labor against the war.
Well, good morning, everybody. When Michael Schwartz was talking about the limits of the president and the constraints that Capitol places on the legislative process, made me think back to the moniker that Franklin Roosevelt earned in the Depression, if you'll remember, as he championed the Social Security and the labor rights and all that. He was denounced as a traitor to his class. And in some short-term sense, perhaps he was. In a longer-term sense, of course, he wasn't. A lot of people have made analogies between Obama and Roosevelt. And I keep thinking, where's the next traitor to their class? And it can't be Obama because he's not of that class. He's an arriviste. Franklin Roosevelt was really from the ruling class of this country and had, in that sense, a standing and an ability to turn around the direction of the country in response to the pressure that so famously arose out of his admonition to A. Philip Randolph, "Go make me do it." People went out, but there was something in the state and something there that was receptive. It's not clear that we have that right now quite in the same way, but I do think that the problem that Michael addressed for us, to go challenge power directly and then let the government do what it's going to do, I think is a very important point. And that's where I think we are. And I want to introduce the work of U.S. Labor Against the War to you in that context. What U.S. Labor Against the War is a coalition or a bringing together of now close to 200 unions, union locals, some big, some small, central labor councils, state federations, other labor organizations, and altogether representing maybe 5 million workers in the United States. State federations like the state of California, the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Vermont, Maryland, other state feds, central labor councils all across the country, big locals like 1199 here in New York, my own local, AFT 2190, United University Professions, PSC, here in New York, about 18 or 20 locals that are part of U.S. Labor Against the War, and trying to develop within the labor movement the direction for peace, and to bring the labor movement into the peace movement, and on the other side, bring the peace movement and the direction of redirection of resources from peace to domestic uses, bring that from the labor perspective into the peace movement. So what we have is, starting in January 2003, in the run-up to the war in Iraq, there was a meeting in January in Chicago in Teamster Hall 705, Local 705 in Chicago. About 100 people got together from different unions around the country and said, we have to do something within the labor movement to stop the war in Iraq. And out of that grew U.S. Labor Against the War, first focused on Iraq, and more recently, of course, changing the focus more, although we're still dealing with Iraq, to Afghanistan. So how do we build this? How have we been doing this work? The labor movement, for those who are in it and those who are not, perhaps you're familiar with the fact that it's fairly top-down. It runs a tight ship. So if you want to move that, our attitude is, and our approach has been, to start from the bottom up and to work at the local levels, to work from the ground up, to generate the support, to generate the pressure on the upper level layers of leadership, so that they will see that there really is a base for this in their union, and they can develop the resolutions and the resources to promote that anti-war movement. And very largely, that's how we've done the work. We've done it from the bottom up. We've done it less by going to a couple people in top positions just to get a resolution, and more trying to really educate, mobilize, and organize the membership and local officials, local executive boards, to do educational work around the war. And we've developed many materials. If you go to the website uslaboragainstwar.org, there's no "the" in that. It's the name of the organization is U.S. Labor Against the War, but the website has no "the" in it. So you can see a vast array of resources that we've developed to do this work. In my own union, we did it through a series of debates at delegate meetings, starting in 2003, where there was enormous disagreement and very, very heartfelt debate about what we should be doing in Iraq. What do we support the troops? What does it mean to support the troops? Why is this union business? Why are we dividing our membership around a question of the war when we really ought to be dealing just with our contract? And all of these questions we debated out in a process through which people actually learn something about what the labor movement is about, what it means to integrate in a broader sense of what society ought to look like and what the values that should govern our society and the labor movement, and how those values in that larger picture then comes to influence what we do around contracts, around mobilizing our membership for the more day-to-day operations that unions are responsible for. So what we did in the case of Iraq was to build this directed at the war, but also in conjunction with and in solidarity with the Iraqi labor movement. So what we found was, pretty soon, after the war began in 2003, there was a delegation, an international labor delegation that went to Iraq. And 2 Americans from U.S. Labor Against the War were part of that delegation. And in that trip, in October 2003, we learned that there was a very well-developed labor movement in Iraq, and we made contact with that. And through the years, we've had delegations of Iraqi workers and their leadership here to the United States 3 times. We have been to Iraq. We've been meeting with them in London and in Algiers and in other places in order to develop a kind of solidarity around the common issues that Iraqi workers face along with us. Just to give you one example, in 2003, of course, the U.S. swept away the Saddam regime. They had the whole de-Baathification process. They got rid of all the old laws and everything else. Paul Bremer was there as the proconsul or whatever you want to call him to make sure everything was going along according to the neoliberal agenda. And when they swept away all the Ba'athist regime, there was one law that they kept. They looked through the whole thing and they said, wow, this is a keeper. And the one law they kept was from 1987, where Saddam Hussein said, no public worker can have a union in Iraq. Now, of course, the Iraqi economy is almost all public. Oil, transportation, the ports, schools, electric power generation, transport, it's all public sector, so they couldn't ever have a union. So we thought, well, wow, they can't have, but you know, in North Carolina, you can't have a union either. In Indiana, you can't have a union. Now in Wisconsin, they're telling us you can't have a union. So right there, on the ground, there's a basis for solidarity and for a deepening of understanding of what are labor rights, what is our government doing, what are the interests that are being promoted in Iraq and in the United States. You know, I used to say, we don't want George Bush ruling Iraq because we don't want him ruling America. It's the same kind of struggle, the same solidarity issues around labor rights and around democracy and around a society that is not divided and organized on religious lines, which the U.S. went in and imposed, and which the Iraqi labor movement is very opposed to. There are many divisions in the Iraqi labor movement, just like there are divisions in our own. One division that does not exist is you will not find a Shia union and a Sunni union. Those divisions do not exist in the labor movement. Whatever the political differences, all the unions are united across religious and ethnic, religious lines, not so much ethnic, because the Kurds have their own union organizations in the north. So when we do this work in Iraq, around Iraq, those were the kinds of solidarity issues that we were able to build upon. And of course, that was George Bush's war, and so it was easier to develop an opposition to it just because it was based on lies and because it was a Bush's war and the labor movement wasn't particularly interested in defending George Bush. When we come to Afghanistan, it's a little bit more complicated. It's more complicated because the American public thinks of Afghanistan perhaps a little differently than it did Iraq, because after all, the attacks on the United States originated from Afghanistan, although I'm proud to say, being a resident here of New York, that that's not a view that we in New York hold. The people in New York are overwhelmingly against the war in Afghanistan, have been from the start, despite the fact that this was, of course, the center of those attacks. But in the larger public, at least to start with, there was a lot of support for that, for the legitimacy of that war compared to Afghanistan, compared to Iraq. So as we have taken up the question of Afghanistan, the situation that we have in the United States is very different from what it was when the Iraq war was the hot question. It's different not only because it's Obama's war instead of Bush's war. It's different not only because people's understanding of the origins of the war are different, but it's different because it's happening in a very different economic time. And what we have found in addressing the war in Afghanistan in the labor movement is that an essential piece of it has to be tying the war to the economic crisis. And that flyer that I just passed around U.S. Labor Against the War flyer, Move the Money, Rebuild America. Take a look on the back of that flyer. There's a little chart. And I have this data here, I have it here for all the states. But just to give you an idea, take a look at New York. Paid for Iraq and Afghanistan this fiscal year, the people of the state of New York paid federal taxes, income taxes. Out of those taxes, a certain share goes to Iraq and Afghanistan. If you apply the fraction of the total U.S. budget that goes to Iraq and Afghanistan to how much taxes New Yorkers paid, you find that $15.5 billion of the cost of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan for this year originated here in New York. Okay, you got that number? Now, if you go to the next column to the right, you'll see that the state deficit that we're struggling with is $8.5 billion. If you would take half the money that people in New York have paid for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan this year and bring it back to New York, the whole budget crisis would be solved. That's an interesting number. That's a powerful thing. And if you add it up for all the states in the country, which I just did yesterday, $171 billion this fiscal year for Iraq and Afghanistan. That doesn't count interest on the debt. It doesn't count the long-term health costs of the Veterans Administration, none of that. Just the cost this year, $171 billion. The total state deficits for the whole country, all 50 states, is $124 billion. Now, part of the stimulus package from a couple of years ago was about $50 billion that went to the states in order to forestall the budget crises that we now have and the layoff of teachers and so on and so forth. And that money is now running out. And often you hear about that. Oh, we have this budget crisis because the stimulus money is running out. I don't want to hear that there's no money, right? We don't want to hear in the labor movement that there's no money to fund education, that there's no money for transportation projects, that there's no money for jobs. In the beginning of 2010, or the very end of 2009, there was a jobs summit, you may remember. And Obama called together all the heads of the big corporations and the labor union people and all kinds of folks were there to figure out how do we create jobs. And Obama came and he gave them their marching orders for the day. And at the end of his giving the marching orders, he said, we really want to hear all your ideas, but don't forget we don't have any money. He actually said that at the job summit. Well, we in the labor movement don't want to hear that there's no money. We want to make the connections between the actual needs that people have and that our members have and the kind of society that we have that takes the priorities in a direction to fight wars that we don't agree to and to neglect the things that are so desperately needed. So what this flyer does in relation to the campaign in Wisconsin is to make some of these connections. And what we're doing in U.S. Labor Against the War within the labor movement is trying to make these connections and to take on directly the larger questions of what is the character of the society that we live in and find ways to bring those questions into the labor movement. Now, it's not easy because here we're talking about how do you do this outside electoral strategy. The labor movement in its leadership is completely dedicated to an electoral strategy. It's totally dedicated to making sure that Democrats get elected with sad results. So we have a task within the labor movement to try to move beyond or around or together with that electoral strategy to find ways to engage our members in the campaigns that are necessary to take on the war and the powers behind the war directly. And in doing that, in addressing the budget crises, and in addressing the need to defend unions as the last bastion against corporate power, I mean, as weak as unions are, it's the last really large organized force in the country that is capable of resisting corporate power, which is why they're outgunning for it. That's what we just saw in Wisconsin. It wasn't a budgetary issue. It's not a question of arithmetic and where are the numbers. It's this ideologically driven attack on labor, and we have to respond to that, starting out of what the actual questions are that people are confronting, these budget crises, and then drawing out of that through the kinds of materials that I've given you here, those connections in a campaign to bring labor into the peace movement and into a broad movement for new priorities. So there is now, you'll see here links to the New Priorities Network, which is a coalition of labor and peace and student and community groups from all around the country trying to find ways to address the budget crisis and then to bring it through that questions about what is the nature of the society that we live in and what are the priorities and what are the political tasks that we have to change those priorities. Now we know that these things can change very quickly. The constellation of power. We saw it in Egypt, we saw it in Tunisia, we saw it in the United States in various parts of our history. It's pretty bleak out there right now in this country. It just is. Doesn't mean that next week or next year it's going to be that. We have some work to do. This is the kind of work that we're doing in the labor movement, and we think that that's where the future lies, is a political movement for new priorities and for a new direction in the country that looks not only at the specific question of, wait a minute, I'm a teacher, what about my schools? But takes, wait a minute, I'm a teacher, what about my schools, to what kind of a society is it that destroys public education? What kind of a society is it that won't give health care to people but will give money to the insurance companies? What kind of a society is it that will take our young men and women and send them to wars that are absolutely fruitless from the point of view of our own interests as working people and as ordinary teachers? That's the kind of question and the kind of movement that we're building. And if you're interested in that, I have some other materials here from U.S. Labor Against the War, membership form, our statement of our mission statement. And one of the things that we have produced as a document is this DVD, Why Are We in Afghanistan? It's 27 minutes, and then there's a 10-minute sort of express version on here. I have copies of this. They're $5, and I would encourage you to pick one up and use it in your communities, in your schools, in your union meetings. We've had some pretty good success with it, and it helps to put the context of American occupation and war in Afghanistan in the context of these larger issues of resources, values, and the history of American intervention overseas. So please do check it out. Why Are We in Afghanistan? And the work of U.S. Labor Against the War. I appreciate very much the chance to be here today and thank the organizers of the session.
Next we're going to have Todd Ensign. Todd is an attorney. He's the director of the organization Citizen Soldier. It's a GI and veteran rights advocacy organization based here in New York. For nearly 3 years, he was also the co-coordinator of The Different Drummer. The Different Drummer was the first GI coffee house of the current war period. So those of you from the Vietnam era might know what the coffee houses were all about. The drummer worked with Fort Drum soldiers and their families and helped support their demand for effective treatment of PTSD, depression, and traumatic brain injury. Todd is going to be discussing the challenges faced in trying to organize within the military today. I'll just note that he's also the author of, most recently, the book America's Military Today, The Challenge of Militarism, 2004.
What I try to do in this article is in Vets for Peace newspaper almost 2 years ago, is try to explain what we experienced at Fort Drum. And it was pretty interesting. I'm not going to go into it much because obviously those of you who are interested can read it here. But I'm going to put these here, and those of you who are interested, just take one. Of course, you can look on their website as well. What we learned up there, try to bring it into today is that the whole sense of community has changed. And some of us guys with gray hair, balding or whatever, had a memory of a different movement, a different time. And those, I see a few shaking their heads. Yeah, and the GI Coffee House at that time was a place where people came together. They were very exciting. Some of you have probably seen the film No Sir, Yes Sir, No Sir, No Sir, something. Sir, No Sir. Sir, No Sir, thank you. And it's the story of that movie. It's definitely worth taking a look at. It's a very interesting film. And you'd be amazed at the dynamism and the vitality of that movement among active duty soldiers. And guys just sitting around in a room with their hair this long, and they're talking all kinds of stuff. And they pan around the room, there's pictures of Che Guevara. Of course, they got Jimi Hendrix and Linda Ronstadt and the others too, or what was the other one? Janis Joplin, exactly. And so we were in the back of our minds thinking that we know, yes, today it's an all-volunteer force. In my book, I go into all that, so those of you who want to kind of understand where this has gone, pick it up, because it's a big shift, an enormous shift. And so we knew it was different. It's all volunteer. Everyone's getting a living wage. People earning more money than they ever earned back home. They're not at the night window at Wendy's. They got a good job. They're making good pay. They've got health insurance. How many of us have that anymore? They got a pension after 20 years. Half pay for life. Hey, not too bad. If you could last 20 years, that is. So that's the military we're facing. They all live on base. They live in apartments. No longer the barracks, the stuff you see from the old From Here to Eternity. That's all gone. Apartments as nice as most of the things that probably better than most of us live in today. So it's a very different military. And so we started out, we did what we could do. We organized dances, parties, political events. We showed films. We had Iraq films. We had Afghan films. And what we found was that the way that soldiers today experience their community is not something that's really part of that movement. And we found that we had good dynamic meetings. We had peace people in from Ithaca and Syracuse and down south, and Howie, our brother here, was up at many of them. And it was great, but it was not a soldier's setting. It was not soldiers and sailors or Marines coming into it. And there are two other projects today. One's at Fort Lewis in Washington State. The other's at Fort Hood in Texas. You probably know this. They have a more, they're hanging on. But I would argue that the whole sense of community, the way that people define themselves today as part of a community, has fundamentally changed. We all need to think about that. Working virtually. Yeah, hey man, I'm 70 years old. Working, what the hell are you talking about? Working virtually. You wrote a paper, you typed it up on your Underwood, and you turned it in. Not anymore. People work. My partner works in our home all the time, all over the world, all the time. That's what a lot of people are doing. That's going to change your sense of how you relate to your community and the people around you. The neuroscience is beginning to do some work now. I'm just touching on things. These are worth looking at. On the impact of this technology on memory, hello, attention spans, reflection, ability to reflect, to think, to step back and say, let me take another look at this. Maybe on Saturday I'll just go out for a walk. I'm not saying people don't do this, and obviously this conference is a statement that a lot of people still do this. But we're talking about broader trends here, and we've got to figure out ways to confront this whole question. A lot of my daughter, I have a 22-year-old daughter, she tells me a lot of her friends define their community by their Facebook friends. I saw a killing the other night in Brooklyn. Maybe I'm being unfair to Brooklyn, maybe it was Queens. And they had a party where they got people to come on Facebook to come to the party. A party! I mean, I'm sorry. We had a party, you had your friends, people you knew. They brought their friends. And of course, someone came, didn't want to pay to get in, and they killed somebody. It's terrible. So these are all big shifts. Can we stop it? No. Is it way beyond our control to really influence it? Yes. It's being driven by some of these same powerful institutions that have already been referred to here. And we're not going to stop. We have to be creative in thinking, how are we going to move through that and bring people together in another way? And how do we organize people? How do we bring people into some new process? There's no question, a couple facts about those wars, as one of the gentlemen said, there's no question, most soldiers today, Howie knows this, he's up by Fort Drum, most soldiers today, if you ask them about the war in an informal setting, they'd say, shit. They're not stupid. They understand what those wars are. See this film, if you can, Restrepo. Anyone seen it in here? Oh, great. It's hard to get, but this guy, Sebastian Junger, who wrote The Perfect Storm, pretty exciting movie. He went to Restrepo. It's a fire base in Afghan. And he spent a year there with a cameraman, off and on. And they just captured these soldiers in a unit, an army unit in Restrepo, and what they were trying to do. And there's a couple scenes in it that if they weren't so sad, they'd be absolutely hilarious. And one of them is, they go to meet with the mullahs, the local men who run the town, the ville, and they sit down with them, and there's this earnest young captain, I'll bet you $1, he's a West Pointer. He's hard charging, he's in there, he wants to do this job, he's trying, of course they have the interpreter, of course, because none of them speak Pashto or Dori, of course. And so he's got the interpreter there, and he's firing questions at the mullahs. And I don't know if you guys, if here's ever been to Afghanistan, but these guys are just sitting there, and they're looking at these, and the soldiers are all around them. They know what it means. They sit there, they're going to get, some Yankee dollar, they're going to get some big cartons of food and whatever else. So they sit there. And the young captain is just talking to them, imploring them, you've got to help us more. We're not doing a good enough job of getting intelligence. We're being bombarded at night. We're being sniped, blah, blah, blah. And these mullahs just sit back, And you sit there and you say, who the hell could believe that we are going to be able to work in this setting militarily? I mean, and at the very end of the film is this really sad little line that says, after 11 soldiers were killed and 25 were injured, the U.S. Army withdrew from Restrepo back into somewhere else. As that Hokanga Valley disaster, hundreds of people were injured and killed up there. So the soldiers understand this. Guys that served in Restrepo understand the folly of this. But the fact is, back to our president, that he and others have decided, I think, my theory on it is, it's kind of like the 50s politicians with communism, the 90s and this century's politicians, it's terrorism. You don't step on that, that's a third rail of politics, don't step across it. And I just thought it was incredible. We've got a brigade going out from Fort Drum right now. I've been counseling a kid up there. He doesn't want to go. He's been on 2 other deployments. The 3rd brigade up there, they're going literally now. And here he is home, can't decide quite what to do. It's big cost for him, big risk for him, his family. Dishonorable discharge, probably a year or 2 in prison. It's a very big question for him. And at the same time this morning, I opened up the paper, and Obama is meeting with Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marsh, is it? It may not be quite the name. And he's meeting him about the July pullouts. And I thought, how does that read for this poor kid? He's supposed to get on a plane this coming week and go there, and here's the president saying, well, we got to start planning for the pullout. I mean, talk about cynical politicking. I mean, I can't think of anything more. And it's unprecedented, really. But and will we pull out in July? I doubt it. But the fact is, that's what they play with. And one difference I would make from Professor Schwartz is about, it's true that many people in this country saw Obama's election as somehow an achievement of something really important. There's no question, being part of the civil rights movement, the night he won the North Carolina primary, I had tears running down my face, as probably most of you did, because I remember what that atmosphere was like 40 years ago, or even 20 years ago. And it was a wonderful thing to see him be able to win the North Carolina primary. It was wonderful. But let's not carry it too far. And the work that I do in the national security field, the military field, I didn't take any clairvoyance to say nothing will change. And that's a sad comment, but this is hard stone we're chipping here, very hard stone. But the one thing we have is the soldier, and it's female and male, 15% of them are female today. And we have the soldier who's experiencing in their gut and in their heart and with their buddies what it means to carry out these wars of adventure and really imperialist wars. And that's a powerful thing. But the challenge, of course, is how do we connect to them? How do we show them our support? IVAW is a step in that direction. Iraq Vets Against the War. Some of you know it, probably support it. Unfortunately, Iraq Vets Against the War has fewer than 2,000 members. Guess how many people have already returned from Iraq and Afghanistan? Soldiers. Any guesses? 1 million? 1.5 million. Keep going. 2.2 million people. And almost half of those have been discharged. So I work as part of their advisory thing. We've got a big challenge within that organization and similar groups to try to figure out a way to connect with these people. Third, remember, you know this, the RAND studies found that 1/3 of returning combat veterans suffer post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and or suicidal ideation. That's an incredible number. It's an incredible number. And if you want a day to kind of wake yourself up, go out to Brooklyn, go out to Tillery Street, and just watch people coming in there. People coming in there, vets. That's a VA center, I should have said medical center. People, or go up to 23rd Street and just see people coming in. And the number of claims that are filed against the number that are granted, the number of people who never appear. By the VA's own numbers, over half of the people that presumably have a valid claim never appear at the VA. And Howie's familiar with guys like that. Will come up and say, man, nah, I ain't going down there. And so there's a level of alienation, there's a level of embitterment, and there's a level of crisis, really, in people. And I don't want to leave you painting too dark or bleak a picture, but we have to be realistic about where we can move this. And one thing we've got to do is say to them, you know, you're back, welcome home. I don't like to use the word warrior personally, but we have to acknowledge the sacrifices they've made in a really non-judgmental way, because they are just complete, are we, okay, they are completely at the mercy of the society. Michigan, the state I'm from originally, has lost 200,000 industrial jobs in the last 4 years. So that's 200 people, workers, union jobs, pension jobs, who are not any longer working, and their children, their sons and daughters. The town I'm from, Battle Creek, Kellogg plant, rubble. 5,000 union jobs 20 years ago, rubble. And what they run to, this is hilarious, the great, Bush's great Secretary of Commerce. It's not like Bush in a way, you can really get after him. His great Secretary of Commerce, Gutierrez, president of Kellogg. He's the one that did the whole master plan to Macadora. Let's get down to Monterrey, New Mexico. Monterrey, Mexico, excuse me. And now the Kellogg executives and their families don't dare to leave the compound because the drug wars have grown so serious they can no longer, they're not even sure they can go to the plant anymore. This is one of the small fruits of deindustrialization. So it's not too hard to understand why recruiters can go into those schools and be treated not with suspicion, but with open arms. And I've had teachers who were anti-war tell me, you know, Todd, I just cannot tell these kids that they shouldn't do this because, frankly, it's this or the street. And that's a tough challenge, too. We got to continue to work that, too. So I leave you with a rather pessimistic message, but we need to think about how to communicate, how do young people under 25 relate today, and how can we support these soldiers in new and different creative ways. And that's the message I bring. Thanks.
Thank you, Todd. And then lastly, save the best for last, we have Steve Early. Steve is a longtime organizer with Communication Workers of America. Lately, he's been dedicating a lot of time and energy to labor journalism. He's the author of the book Embedded with Organized Labor, and then he has a new book just out this month, The Civil Wars in U.S. Labor, Birth of a New Workers' Movement or Death Throes of the Old? Question mark.
What I'd like to talk about, based on my experience as a union rep for nearly 30 years in the Northeast, is a great little case study currently underway in the state of Vermont in building leverage and grassroots power for progressive social change at the state level. It's the Vermont Healthcare Reform Campaign that's been spearheaded by the Vermont Workers Center and a coalition of groups. We're lucky to have with us here this morning two of the best young organizers in the state of Vermont, Jonathan Kissam from Burlington and Kate Kennelstein from Brattleboro. They are both going to be conducting a whole 2-hour session on this campaign, which I'm only going to describe in a very quick 3 or 4 minutes. What's interesting about the current very promising campaign for a state-level single-payer system in Vermont, which is a fight very much in progress, is that everywhere else in the country, what was heralded as healthcare reform at the national level last year, and which is demonized by the right as Obamacare, the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, is being sued by 28 states. You have a huge right-wing legal and political challenge to this mess of a bill that Congress passed last year. A couple of conservative federal judges who are not as left-leaning as my old law school buddy and recent New York State Judge Karen Smith have already ruled this to be unconstitutional, Obamacare. Vermont, the great state of Vermont, is one of the few bright spots in the whole country where people are trying to go beyond PPACA and create a healthcare system that really does protect patients and makes care affordable, which Obama's bill or law I don't think is really going to do. I've been involved in Vermont politics and organizing for about 40 years. We have my old Union Communication Workers of America, a couple hundred members in the state, mainly telephone workers who are employed by Verizon, now by a company called Frontier. And we have a small group, a dwindling band of hardy non-majority trade unionists at IBM, part of a group called the Alliance at IBM. And what we've tried to do over the years in New England with our telephone worker members is use the long series of strikes that we've had, 5 strikes in the last 25 years over this issue of medical benefits, to do membership education and political consciousness raising about why we need to shift from a system of job-based health insurance, one that has this costly and dysfunctional, completely unnecessary role for employers and private insurers, and move to a social insurance system. And there's no better, crucible of struggle to do this kind of political education. I mean, you can hand people a pamphlet that, written by an expert like Ollie Fine from the PNHP. Here's the description of the perfect healthcare system. But if you're a worker at Verizon and you're part of the 5% of the population, working population, that still pays nothing up front, no premium contributions, has what was demonized last year by the Democrats and Obama as a Cadillac plan, right, that is so prone to abuse and overuse that it needs to be taxed and, as a curb on medical cost inflation and as a way of raising money to cover the uninsured. You would think it's kind of a hard sell that people should jettison their alleged Cadillac, which most telephone workers in Vermont and elsewhere always thought of as a Chevy that everybody should have in their garage, but, get rid of the Cadillac and trade it in for, like whatever they have in Canada, this single payer thing, whatever the hell that is, or Medicare for all, which I think is a better way of describing it. Well, the only way that we were able to get people to understand that, this dwindling band of unionized workers who are the beneficiaries of a kind of crumbling private welfare state can move to something better is by moving to a social insurance system that severs the link between employment and coverage and really enables you to unite your struggle for decent benefits at work to a system that covers everybody. And in many of our contract campaigns and strikes and fights over who is going to pay what for health care at the phone company, we carefully framed it as a struggle for health care for all, not health cuts at Verizon or Bell Atlantic or Fairpoint or any of the other phone companies, AT&T, that we've had to deal with. What's interesting about the Vermont Workers Center is it unites students, unionized workers, non-union workers, the disabled community, immigrants, the uninsured, the underinsured, the allegedly overinsured, brings people together in a community labor coalition that's part of the National Jobs with Justice Network that's been very effective. It also involves, of course, doctors and nurses, people who are interested in healthcare policy issues from a technical and professional standpoint. It's reframed the whole healthcare reform struggle up there. Healthcare is a human right, not as it shouldn't be a market commodity. It shouldn't be something that is provided by profit-making insurance companies. They have built a very strong grassroots base for the current legislative push, which is taking advantage of large Democratic majorities in the state legislature, a newly elected Democratic governor. But for many years, and this is, I think, where the non-electoral angle plays in, they've battled both Democrats and Republicans who have stood in the way of real health care reform in Vermont. Most recently, a Republican governor named Jim Douglas, who was a strong foe of real health care reform. reform, but before him, the great Howard Dean also found a way when he was governor to sidetrack single payer. So now we have in Vermont, as that article suggests, a kind of perfect storm for going beyond what was enacted by Congress last year, getting on the road to real change in the system. And I think it's critical to understand that one reason for this is that Vermont has a 35-year history of building independent political action. I mean, it's one of the few states where, unlike the Greens, who I support in Massachusetts, and Howie's been involved in here in New York, they've been actually able to elect people. They have representatives, the Vermont Progressive Party, in the state legislature, the House and the Senate. They have a long-serving independent socialist, Bernie Sanders, has been a congressman and senator. They have a progressive who's the mayor of the largest city, and there have been several before him. They have built a viable third-party movement that puts pressure on the Democrats from the left. So you need a grassroots movement doing the kind of education around this single-issue healthcare reform that the Workers' Center has done for more than a decade. You need unions as part of that coalition, though they're don't have a great deal of density in Vermont outside the public sector. And you need a third party that pulls the Democrats to the left and basically makes it a political liability for them, to move in the direction that Obama has at the national level, because there's no similar force pulling him towards the left or avoiding the kind of centrist muddle that so much of his administration has come across as. Brother Michael here described the top labor leadership as running a tight ship. I think they're presiding over a sinking ship, and it's springing leaks all over the place. And what's encouraging lately, of course, is that some of the passengers, particularly up in Cairo by the lake in Wisconsin, have taken matters into their own hands and are mobilizing to try to provide a course correction before it's too late. Certainly Vermont is one of the best examples of this. Many other states, single-payer activity is kind of stalled out while people wait to see how Obamacare plays out. It's not going to play out well. Hasn't made one single bit of difference in the struggles at every bargaining table. If there's union people here involved in negotiations about medical benefits, you know that the pressure for healthcare cost shifting is just as great today as it was a year ago, and it'll be even greater over the next few years while we wait for this federal plan to be implemented. So in Vermont, they're not waiting. They're trying to go beyond it, and the model for what they've done, bottom-up, grassroots, community labor coalition, is one that we need to emulate in many other states. Thank you.